Uh-oh, Viltrox is back with yet another new series of lenses. And this one really kind of bridges the gap between the Air and the Pro series. Earlier this year, I reviewed the Pro series 85mm f1.4, an amazing lens. However, weighed in at 800 grams, which is pretty hefty for most people. The new EVO series from Viltrox comes with some of the lightweight qualities and more compact size of the Air series. This lens weighs 340 grams, but it also comes with the greater complexity of the Pro series lenses, including more features, some weather sealing, things like that, making this a amazing kind of mid-range lineup for Viltrox. The new 85mm f2 from their EVO series, as we're going to see, is amazing optically, has good autofocus, and is very feature-rich, but comes at a price tag of just $275. That makes it basically the cheapest lens in the class, outside of a few attempts at 85mm lenses from some other brands that were really low budget quality, but this is anything but, and that tells me that this is going to be yet another seriously disruptive series from Viltrox and may hit the sweet spot for a lot of people. I see this as the kind of lens for those that really love Sigma's I series, for example. And today we're going to dive into this particular lens and see if it should jump to the top of your list if you're looking for a compact 85mm prime. Sound interesting? Well, let's dive in and take a look. Today's episode is sponsored by the all-new Fantom Tracker 2.0. Fantom has not only seriously upgraded the visual look of the card, but now we have a superior build quality made with tempered glass and metal alloys. This credit card size tracker can be locally tracked via a 90 decibel beeping noise, but also on a global level via Apple's Find My Network and its map. The addition of NFC means that you can also use the card to trigger an automation. Just tap it. The tracker fits perfectly in any wallet or bag and assures you won't lose your valuables. It has a built-in rechargeable battery that can be easily charged via any wireless charger, and a single charge can last up to 6 months. The Fantom Tracker 2.0 makes for a seriously cool gift, so visit store.fantomwallet.com and use code Dustin20 at checkout for 20% off. That's store.fantomwallet.com and use code Dustin20 for 20% off. Now, in full disclosure, this lens was sent to me by Viltrox for evaluation. As always, they have had no input on this review, and they will not see it before you do. This is a completely independent review, and all of my findings are my own. All right, let's talk build and handling. As I mentioned earlier in the intro, I think that the new EVO series in many ways is an effective hybrid of the Air and the Pro series. And so it is a slightly scaled up version of the Air series in terms of the size, a little bit larger body than what those lenses are, but still in a very moderate kind of way. Likewise, it is essentially a scaled down version of the Pro series where it has a lot of the features of that, a bit of the weather sealing, but maybe not to that same degree. And so it really produces a nice kind of medium level that I think is going to attract a lot of people. This really does have a very nice build quality. And I will note that relative to all the other lenses that are competing in the 85mm f1.8 space here on Sony FE, this lens definitely has the biggest feature set. And so that includes having a robust approach to aperture. None of the others have the aperture ring, but this has the full featured aperture where you can go through with clicks at 1/3 stop to tenths. You can declick the aperture with a switch on the side, and then you can do smooth aperture racks, which is going to be more useful for video. It doesn't have an iris lock, but there is a little bit firmer detent and a little bit bigger space between f16 and automatic for control within the camera. The aperture iris itself has 9 blades inside, and you can see as you go through that rack again, it does maintain a fairly circular shape. You can see the aperture blade shape just a little bit, but the overall effect is going to be a circular aperture shape. Also here we have an AF/MF switch and a focus hold button. So just to give you an idea of some of the comparisons, I reviewed earlier this year a lens that I actually really like. It's the LK Samyang 85mm f1.8 Prima lens from them. And so this has essentially the AF/MF switch on the side, and that's it as far as the features there. It does have some weather sealing The Sony 85mm f1.8, it has an AF/MF switch and it has the focus hold button, and it has some degree of weather sealing, minor degree of weather sealing, but it does not have anything in terms of aperture control. Likewise, the Zeiss Batis, which is about $1,000 more than this lens, it has basically the same feature set as does the Sony. And so we're getting a very full-featured a full set of features here relative to the competition. As far as the finish here, it is a mixture of metals and high-grade engineered plastics. It definitely has a higher grade feel than what the Air series does. It feels like a lightweight premium lens, to be sure. And so definitely feels a little bit more upscale than what this Prima lens does, and frankly, more upscale than the Sony lens, even though the Sony is more than double in price. Got a nice new shiny EVO badge here on the side. It's a great looking lens, and it is a highly functional one as well. It does come with a hood and the lens pouch. The hood itself, it is plastic, but it is thick plastics. It doesn't feel chintzy at all, and it does bayonet on with good precision, and once it's there, it actually locks in place quite well. There's no lock, but it does bayonet on there tightly. All good there. Now, in terms of the size, it is 69mm in diameter, or 2.71 inches. That's a little bit slimmer than any of the competition, just a little bit slimmer than the LK Samyang, but more like 5-6 millimeters, not centimeters, slimmer than what the Sony lens is. And so it is nice and slim. It's 76mm long, and so that is longer than the Samyang, as you can see from this photo here, but it is shorter than the Sony lens. The weight here is 340 grams or 12 ounces, and so that's a little bit lighter than the Sony lens, 371 grams, and it's a little bit heavier than the LK Samyang lens, which is 272 grams. The Zeiss Batis lens is heavier than any of these. So overall, we have got a compact size. Now, yes, we do have a slightly smaller maximum aperture. This at f2, that is 1/3 stop less bright than the f1.8 aperture of the opposing lenses. So that does need to be taken into consideration. However, we do have a nicer build quality and also a more robust feature set. And so again, I think that Viltrox has done a good job of keeping the weight moderate here under those circumstances. Front filter thread is 58mm. That is a little smaller than the competing lenses, and again, it's probably because of that f2 maximum aperture. At the back, we'll see a signature USB-C port for doing firmware updates, and Viltrox is good at updating their firmware and supporting their lenses, at least in that regard. And you also will see a red-orange colored gasket, weather sealing gasket that is here. So there's definitely a gasket here. They do mention in their literature that there is a coating on the front element to help with fingerprints, moisture there. What I think we don't have is internal seals, because there's no mention of those, whereas with the Pro and the Lab series, it does mention the internal seals. So I think that this is a degree of weather sealing that's similar to Sigma's I series, for example, where we've got a coating and we've got a rear gasket, but we don't necessarily have internal seals. At the same time, however, I mean, something is better than nothing, and so I'm thankful to have that. Minimum focus distance is 74 centimeters, so you can focus a little bit closer than competing lenses, which tend to be in the 80 centimeter range, but your maximum magnification of 0.13 times is just a little bit better than some and ties others. And so 85 millimeters lenses rarely have a strong maximum magnification, so about the best that I've seen in the class, outside of a few macro exceptions, is about 0.14 times. So this is right in the hunt of being at the better end of this particular class. And so up close performance is very strong. It's a nice flat plane of focus, good contrast, good detail. All of that is very, very good. So I think that this is a really compelling package here. I think that they have done a fantastic job of finding a great balance of getting lots of features, nice build quality, but also keeping the size smaller, lighter, and more reasonable in that regard. Good job, Viltrox. So let's talk autofocus. I'm shooting all of these outdoor segments on the EVO lens mounted on my Alpha 1 Mark II. And to give you a sense of how well it tracks and renders here outdoors. Now, the EVO series, at least in this particular iteration, is going to be powered by an STM rather than their Hyper VCM focus motors. Viltrox obviously has evaluated that STM is sufficient for this lineup because of the smaller glass elements that it needs to move. And so far it looks like the Pro Series lenses have a single Hyper VCM focus motor, whereas the Lab series employ multiple Hyper VCM focus motors to drive those bigger, heavier glass elements. Truth of the matter is that while I prefer the higher end system, the STM works great here. And you can see that focus speed, if not instant, is very quick going back and forth. What's more, the focus system is smooth and it's not quite as quiet as the Hyper VCM focus motor, but it's quiet enough that I can only hear a very faint clicking if I focus with the lens right next to my ear. And so in actual operation, you're probably not going to hear any kind of focus sounds at all. Furthermore, I found focus had no problem in snapping into place. For example, this shot, I only had a split second to get it because I had to walk past someone and try to quickly shoot before someone else walked into frame, and also to try to time catching my son kind of hitting the right spot that I wanted him in time. Focus snapped on, no problem. Likewise, in other situations when I was shooting either portrait type shots or just shooting while out hiking, things like that, focus was always accurate and quick, locked on, and delivered very well focused results. And so for all the applications I used it for stills, I had no concerns at all. Autofocus did everything that I wanted it to, and while, on paper I might prefer the higher end focus system, the truth of the matter is that it does everything you need it to right here with the STM focus motor, so I have no problem with that. So let's talk video autofocus. You can see that if I approach the camera and I duck in frame and out of frame, that autofocus snaps right back with good accuracy and good confidence. What's more, you can see even when it goes to the back and then back to me, it does so with nice smoothness as opposed to just a big jump in one direction. Likewise, when I did my focus pulls, I saw something similar. And despite this being a stepping motor, there are no visible steps that I could see. There was no settling, there was no pulsing, but rather it was good, smooth sweeps back and forth. And you'll see that while there is some focus breathing there, it's actually fairly well controlled for an 85mm focal length, particularly when we're shooting at the maximum aperture of f2. Likewise, when I did my hand test, while there were a few occasions where focus stayed locked on my face, which tends to be the case because the camera is predicting that's what you want in focus, the transitions to and from my hand worked just fine. And so all things considered, I think that autofocus did a good job with that. What's more, with shots outdoors like this, or in some of the segments where I've done talking head like this, focus has been nice and stable without any pulsing around or losing focus on me. And so in that, all of my video clips, focus has been stable, and I would say in general, I am very pleased with the way that autofocus has performed on the EVO 85mm lens. Okay, let's talk image quality. This is an optical design of 10 elements in 8 groups. Relatively simple. There are 2 extra low dispersion elements, 2 high refractive index elements, and you can see here that produces an MTF that is just great. Everything, everywhere save the far corners, it's very, very sharp in the center, very strong in the mid frame, and then from the mid frame there is a slow slide towards the corners, but at a better degree, for example, all across the board than, say, this LK Samyang lens. By the way, this is a lens I love optically, and so the fact that the Viltrox is even sharper and higher contrast is impressive, again, particularly when you consider the price. Also interesting is the MTF chart shows the f8 performance, and while it's a little less sharp in the center and the mid frame, it is very, very consistent. It's pretty much a straight line all across the frame, which tells us that at smaller apertures, while you aren't going to get the same degree of punch in the center of the frame, you're going to get a very even performance all across the frame. When I compared my results between these 2 lenses, and I will do a deeper dive between the 2 because I think that these are the 2 lenses that might get the most cross shops, so somewhere in the future you can expect a video on that. But in terms of just raw sharpness and optics on my test chart, I found that the Viltrox definitely produced stronger images in the center of the frame, as you can see here. More contrast, it kind of pops more. Mid-frame also looks considerably stronger, and while both lenses are weaker in the corners, the Viltrox is less so, and so just sharper all across the frame. Other metrics, I'll give you a quick overview here, and if you want the deep dive, that'll come at the end of the video. But there is a tiny amount of pincushion distortion, just a -2 to correct, and you would be fine not correcting it. Vignette is another story, however. It is fairly strong at a +71 to correct for it. However, I will say this on a positive note for the vignette, that the nature of it has a nice linear flow towards the center of the frame, and the byproduct is it's kind of a Zeiss type feel, which surprised me to say about a $275 lens, but it really does have a bit of that overall look of color contrast and then vignette that creates a look that is kind of special, actually. And so I'm not trying to undersell the vignette there, but I will say that in certain situations it works. Other situations you're going to want to correct it. Fringing is extremely well controlled. There's, on my test chart, almost none before and after the plane of focus in terms of longitudinal style chromatic aberrations. I also found that it held up well when it came to shooting my dad's old SLR, and you can see very low levels of fringing there. Also in high contrast situations, it looks good there as well. And so all of that is very good. Likewise with lateral style chromatic aberration in the corners of the frame, well controlled there. As I mentioned, the Zeiss quality, this lens actually reminds me in some ways of its performance of the Loxia 85mm f2.4, another 85mm lens that has a smaller than average maximum aperture, but it is really fantastic wide open and has a really punchy look to it. This lens is very similar, which is impressive considering it's $1,000 cheaper. In terms of real-world sharpness, I found that it looked great. If you're talking portraits, there's plenty of detail and pop, particularly in those critical areas around the eyes and the lips. It just looks fantastic, even at f2. When I moved to my test chart, I found at 200% magnification on a 61 megapixel body that results look great. Centers very punchy, mid-frame excellent, and then of course in the corners, softer, but still very usable there. And what I found as I began to stop down, f2.8 in the corners, not a big improvement, looking better by f4, and then a little bit better by f5.6, as you can see. By those landscape apertures, results are very sharp all across the frame. Great detail, great contrast, great color, all excellent there. And then at f11, you're going to start to see a little bit of softening due to diffraction. By f16, that's going to be a little bit more obvious at that point. I would say that I was very impressed by the rendering from this lens. I wondered about that because sometimes with a smaller maximum aperture, you are a little bit disadvantaged in terms of your out of focus rendering. In this case, however, while you're not going to have the subject separation of a larger maximum aperture lens, what you do get is really good quality of the out of focus rendering. So at its most minimum focus, as I'm holding this leaf and the background's a little bit further away, of course you can achieve a really strong background blur, and that looks great. A little bit further out, however, in shots like this, and I'm still really impressed. While the background isn't as defocused, what is there is very nicely rendered, very soft and creamy. At medium distances, I still felt like not only was the bokeh rendering decent, but because there's such good contrast and detail on the subject, there's still a very nice amount of subject separation. And this image probably represents the worst that I saw, just because it's an unfavorable ratio of, the foreground pops really well, but the background is not enough defocused and it's busy. And so it looks a little bit busier. But, again, it's not a terrible rendering of that. Not a lot of hard edges or general jitteriness in any of that. So overall, I was very impressed. Colors are really excellent. Viltrox took a big turn for the better a few years ago with their optical glass, and it really shows at this point. I feel like their optical glass, it's pretty close to as good as what I'm seeing from any other brand here on the Sony platform. Looks great. So no hesitation, no concerns there. Flare resistance is a little bit of a mixed bag. In the way that I actually use a lens like this, it actually did really well. This backlit image, bright sun in it, but it held up really well. Whereas focusing on a subject at a large aperture, no real issues with veiling or ghosting. Likewise, in shots where the sun is maybe just a little bit out of frame, I get just a little bit of a glow there that is nice. If I pan right across the sun at f2, you can see that at some angles there's a little bit of flashing, there is some veiling, a little bit of ghosting, mostly in the form of like a halo corona type effect. Stopping down at f11, f11, things get worse to where everything is just exaggerated a bit more. The flashing is stronger. The rays from the sun starts to dominate. So you get a lot of these kind of rays that are coming into it. So I don't like that as well. But again, in a real world situation, I never do that outside of testing a lens. It's just not a practical way of using a lens like this. So, I mean, I think that if you're careful, flare resistance is just fine. My summation is that this is a massive amount of optical performance for such an inexpensive lens. Once again, Viltrox is delivering image quality that is competitive with the very best on the platform for a whole lot less money. And so what's my conclusion? I'm really impressed by what Viltrox has done with this lens. In many ways, it satisfies a lot of what I am looking for in lenses. I do like having more flexibility when it comes to controls, and I like my lenses to be a bit more feature-rich. However, particularly if I'm traveling, I'm going to reach for a small, compact lens every time over a bigger, large aperture lens. If I'm shooting close to home or I'm doing portraits or things like that, sure, I'll reach for the big, heavy lenses. But in many cases, I'm going to reach for the smaller simply for the reason that they're easier to bring along. And if they can produce results as good as what the EVO 85mm can, well, there's not a lot of motivation to grab a bigger, heavier lens. What's more, the value of this lens is undeniable. At $275 US or even less if you use the discount code, it undercuts pretty much everything when it comes to price while delivering, actually in this class, more features and higher performance than any of the competing lenses. That's a very winning combination. And I think that this lens is going to satisfy a lot of people. And I'm actually really intrigued to see what else they could do in this EVO series. I see a lot of potential for maybe f2 variants of lenses, but even beyond that, maybe them exploring with outside of just f2, exploring some different focal lengths, you know, 135mm f2.8, for example, or something in that class that will allow you to have some options as opposed to the optically amazing but big and heavy lenses that are often available at these other type focal lengths. Viltrox has shown that they have a great deal of confidence in just going after pretty much all the market segments at this point outside of zooms. And God help the other companies if they ever start to do that. So at the end of the day, I think that the Viltrox EVO 85mm f2 is another huge win for them, and certainly a lens that I would personally be interested in myself. Now, if you want more information, you've got a couple of options here. You can check out my full text review that's linked in the description down below on the newly redesigned DustinAbbott.net. Check it out. It's worth visiting. Beyond that, if you want a deep dive into the optical performance, you're in the right place. We're going to jump into that right now together. All right, we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. You can see a tiny bit of pincushion distortion right there in the middle of the frame. You can also see I had no problem doing a manual correction, and it corrected in a nice linear way. So no problem there. You can definitely see some vignette concentrated in the corners. It took a +71 to correct to the level that you see there. Now, that vignette is not going to be desirable in all situations, obviously, but in some situations, the kind of linear nature of this really actually plays well in a shot like this. You can see there's great detail on the subject, but you can see that the vignette kind of subtly draws your eye into the center of the frame where the subject is. This is a look that I do associate a lot with Zeiss type lenses, and so I'm actually fairly impressed with how good this looks. Viltrox has done a good job of engineering out the longitudinal style chromatic aberrations, very little fringing before the plane of focus, very little after the plane of focus. Zooming into my dad's old SLR here, I don't see anything messing up in these contrast points here with the lettering. And then as we look at the shiny bits on the SLR, all looks clean there. Likewise, in the area around the specular highlights, you can see no fringing there, all good. I was also impressed in very high contrast situations. For example, the light, obviously very intense light coming through all of this where there's tons of potential for fringing. You can see it's holding up really nicely. Likewise with lateral style chromatic aberrations near the corner of the frame, there's tiny bits of fringing, but it is very mild. Not anything that you're going to see in any kind of real world image where it's not exaggerated like this. So how about resolution and contrast? This is 61 megapixels, and we are testing here at 200% magnification. You can see in the center of the frame, it just pops. There's lots of that mar because it is just so sharp showing up there. Mid-frame looks fantastic. I'm really impressed by how good all of that looks. Likewise, from here to here, very little drop off. And really, it's only at the very corner of the frame where things start to soften up. So in general, a very strong performance. To put that all in perspective, here you can see versus the LK Samyang stop down to f2, you can see in the center of the frame, there's no question the Viltrox has higher contrast and detail. Likewise, if we move to the mid frame, you can see the same is true here. It's just really popping by comparison. And down into the corner, you can see that the same is true there. The Viltrox is just basically consistently better all across the frame, and also a very even performance everywhere. Really pretty impressive. Really the only place that any kind of sharpness improvement is needed is in the corners, and we can see that at f4 it's getting better, and then at f5.6 it is better still. And so you're going to see really good landscape images at these smaller apertures. Here's a good case in point, because if we take an f2 image and an f5.6 image, we look in the center of the frame, there's not really much of a difference there. I mean, contrast and detail looks fantastic on both. We can see as we pan towards the side that they stay largely the same until you get out towards the edge. And you can see here the f2 image has some softening towards the edge, whereas the f5.6 image, it's maintaining that really brilliant sharpness and contrast right off into the corners of the frame. And so that's where, I mean, stopping down is really going to give you the biggest difference, is really towards the periphery of the frame. Expect to see some diffraction starting at f11 and then a little more pronounced at f16 that starts to soften the image. You can see our contrast is dropping due to the effects of diffraction. Unfortunately, it's physics and you can't really avoid that. Here's another look at our minimum focus distance, and maximum magnification is 0.13 times. We can see if we punch in here at 100% that there's very good detail and contrast, very crisp looking up close, and you can see that a fairly flat plane of focus, and so we've also got good detail on the things that fall in frame here. All of that is looking quite good. I'm really impressed with shots like this where depth of field is very, very narrow, but you can see that that contrast and detail really holds up nicely for such an inexpensive lens. Here you see the maximum potential for bokeh. And so I've got this leaf here at minimum focus, and so the background, of course, is really soft and creamy. Here, as we move out to a more distant subject, you can see that there's a little bit of busyness here, but it's really, it's handled quite nicely, and the subject just pops. That contrast and detail there at medium distance is really, really impressive. This is the image that I mentioned earlier as being kind of, I would consider the least favorite as far as the bokeh rendering. It's a very complicated scene, and I'm just shooting basically a little section that's sticking out. On this area, you can see how great the detail and contrast is of the subject, and there's a little bit of busyness here, but in general, it's not bad. If I take this into a portrait situation, you can see again the detail and contrast are fantastic, brilliant. It looks really great. Looking at this defocused area, maybe a little more outlining than what I would like, and of course at only f2 it's not as out of focus as what I would prefer, but it also doesn't look bad. It's not a lot of hard edges, and again, that looks amazing. In this portrait image here, you can see the background, it's not as defocused, but it's still looking nice. Subject is amazing, very consistently crisp. Here again, looking at this angle, there's hard edges on the wood pile. It doesn't look too bad to me, and detail and contrast look amazing. And when it comes to flare resistance, we can see that if we look at the actual area of focus, that detail and contrast is holding up nice, even though we have bright sun right there. So all of that is good, as mentioned previously. Here you can see some of that corona type effect here, a little bit of veiling in this position with really, really bright sun. So not perfect there. And as you stop it down, I don't love this. I just find that starts to dominate the frame because that sunburst just gets way too big. This is at f11, but again, as I said previously, I wouldn't actually ever shoot like this in real-world situations. So generally, I would say that the optical performance is really excellent, particularly for such a budget lens. So hopefully the optical deep dive has helped you to determine whether or not this new EVO 85mm is the lens for you. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.